When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not because I feared being caught, but because of what he might find. Those messages. The ones I had forgotten to delete. I reached for the phone, desperate, but he pulled back with a calm, almost surgical motion and kept reading. I watched his face shift as his eyes moved line by line, and it felt like my life was crumbling in seconds. Yes, he was about to discover the truth. But not all of it. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew exactly when he would reach that message, the one that would shatter everything. That single message that would explain too much and not enough at the same time. My phone buzzed in his grip, the vibration cutting through the silence like a blade. A new notification flashed across the screen, and I saw his face blanch when he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a habit I've had since I was a child, something I do when I'm anxious. My nerves tangled with the dread of realizing what I'd done. His breathing became shallow, uneven, and I could hear it across the 2 feet between us. That was the moment I had feared more than any other. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. The kind of mistake that changes everything forever. And now, I don't know what to do, but let me tell you how it all really happened. Before I share the secret I fought so hard to hide for so long, write in the comments which city you're watching from, and tell me this: have you ever had a secret you tried with all your might to keep buried, only to fail? I never meant for my life to veer into something worth whispering about behind closed doors. For years, everything had followed a script: mornings that smelled of coffee, evenings filled with the muted hum of the TV, and the quiet comfort of a marriage that was steady, if not electric. I had a husband who was kind, reliable, the type of man who remembered to check the oil in my car but not always the color of my blouse. We were good together, or at least that's what I told myself, even when I caught my reflection in the kitchen window at night and wondered if good was enough. When the job offer came, I wasn't searching for a change. It was more like the change found me. A friend of a friend mentioned a position at her husband's firm, secretary work, nothing glamorous, but a reason to get out of the house, to feel useful again. I told myself it was for the paycheck, for the distraction, but deep down, it was for something else. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I wasn't finding it at home. The first day at the office felt like stepping into a world where I didn't belong. The air smelled faintly of toner and stale coffee. Phones rang in clipped bursts, papers shuffled, and everyone moved with the kind of purpose that made me feel like an intruder. And then there was him, the boss. I remember the first time he walked past my desk. He didn't smile, didn't even look directly at me, but something about the way he carried himself made the space feel smaller, more concentrated. It wasn't attraction at first, at least not in the way I understood attraction. It was more a subtle awareness, the way you might notice a shift in the weather before the storm actually comes. His voice was calm, measured, but carried an undercurrent of something I couldn't name. He had a way of leaning against the doorway of the conference room, sleeves rolled just so, that felt accidental and deliberate all at once. I went home that night and didn't mention him. Not to my husband, not even to myself. I cooked dinner, washed the dishes, folded the laundry as if nothing inside me had shifted. But when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I replayed his voice in my head, not the words, just the tone. The days blurred, the way days do when nothing remarkable happens but something is changing beneath the surface. My tasks became routine, answering phones, scheduling meetings, typing out memos that would be read and forgotten. Yet every time I heard his footsteps in the hallway, my spine straightened on instinct. I hated that reaction, it felt juvenile, almost embarrassing. I told myself it was just the newness of the job, that I would get used to it. At home, I noticed myself editing what I shared. My husband would ask how my day went, and I'd talk about the traffic, the broken coffee machine, the way the office printer chewed up paper. I didn't mention the small moments, The way the boss's hand brushed against mine when he passed me a folder, the brief pause when our eyes met and neither of us looked away immediately. Those details stayed tucked in the corners of my mind, like fragile things that would crumble if spoken aloud. I think that's when the first crack appeared. It wasn't a dramatic shattering, just a hairline fracture in the glass of our life. I didn't feel guilty yet. I told myself nothing had happened, and technically, nothing had. But sometimes the things we don't say weigh more than the things we do. One morning, I caught my reflection in the office restroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because I looked different, but because I felt different. I wore the same clothes, did my makeup the same way, but there was something in my expression, a flicker of alertness, a hunger I hadn't seen in years. That evening, as I stood at the kitchen counter slicing vegetables for dinner, I felt an unease I couldn't name. The house was as quiet as always, my husband humming softly in the living room as he read the paper. Nothing was wrong, and yet everything felt off. I had the sense of standing on the edge of something, like a swimmer testing the temperature of deep water. Looking back now, I wonder if the story started here, not with the kiss in the elevator, not with the night that followed, but with these small, almost invisible moments. The ones where you don't make a choice, but the ground shifts beneath you anyway. By the end of that first week, the office didn't feel foreign anymore. It felt familiar. And that's when I realized, familiarity is dangerous. It blurs lines, it numbs warnings. And it was only the beginning. The night the elevator stopped, everything that had been simmering quietly in the background came rushing to the surface, though at the time I didn't recognize it for what it was. I had stayed late at the office that evening, an end-of-week cleanup, catching up on paperwork that wasn't urgent but felt important to finish. The building was mostly empty, the air heavy with that late-hour stillness you only hear when fluorescent lights hum louder than human voices. I remember pressing the button for the ground floor, expecting the usual descent, nothing more. The doors closed with a soft thud, and the elevator lurched into motion. Then, halfway down, it shuddered violently and stopped. The lights didn't go out, but the sudden stillness was almost worse. My breath caught in my throat as I instinctively pressed the emergency button, listening to the hollow ring of a line that no one picked up right away. It wasn't until then that I realized I wasn't alone. He was standing just behind me, leaning slightly against the mirrored wall, his arms folded casually as if this wasn't an inconvenience at all. The boss. I hadn't heard him step in at the last second before the doors closed, but there he was, tall, composed, and unsettlingly calm. "This happens sometimes," he said, his voice low, almost casual. "The old wiring in this building is a mess." I nodded, barely trusting my voice. It was strange, being so aware of another person's presence in such a small space. The elevator wasn't tiny, but it felt like it was closing in, each second stretching longer. I could feel my pulse in my wrists, in my neck, and somewhere beneath that thrum of anxiety was something else I didn't want to name. Minutes passed. I tried to occupy myself by glancing at my phone, but the signal was gone, no bars, no way to distract myself. I could see his reflection in the mirrored wall, the relaxed way he stood as if even this breakdown didn't rattle him. He caught my eye in the glass and smiled, just slightly. "You're not claustrophobic, are you?" he asked. I shook my head quickly. "No. Just not a fan of surprises." The joke should have lightened the mood, but it only heightened the awareness between us. The space felt smaller, warmer. I noticed things I'd never let myself notice before, the way the cuff of his shirt was slightly unbuttoned, the faint trace of aftershave lingering in the still air, the steadiness of his breathing compared to mine. We talked a little, about nothing and everything. He told me the building's maintenance crew was unreliable, that it might take a while. I mentioned the stack of reports I'd left on my desk, pretending to care, but really, I was stalling, just saying words to fill the space. At some point, the conversation paused. Not the awkward kind of silence that makes you reach for small talk, but the kind that seems to thicken the air itself. I turned slightly, and he was closer than I thought, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could see the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his expression as he looked at me. The elevator jolted faintly, like it was trying to decide whether to move again. My hand shot out to the side for balance, brushing the wall, and that's when it happened. We looked at each other, just for a moment. Not long. And then, before either of us seemed to think about it, we moved that last inch between us. We kissed. It was brief, almost tentative, and when we pulled back, it wasn't clear who stepped away first. I felt my chest rise and fall too fast, the air suddenly thin. Neither of us spoke immediately, and in that pause, the reality of what just happened hung in the air like static. The elevator jerked again, this time with more determination, and with a low groan, it began to move. The moment broke. We both stepped back, our bodies suddenly formal, polite again, like two strangers sharing a ride. But there was no undoing it. When the doors finally slid open on the ground floor, we walked out side by side, saying nothing. The lobby felt too bright, the night outside too sharp. I caught my reflection in the glass doors as we left the building, and for the first time, I didn't recognize the look in my own eyes. On the way home, the streets blurred past my car windows, but my thoughts didn't stay with the traffic lights or the road signs. They kept circling back to that single moment in the elevator. A kiss that lasted seconds but somehow felt like it cracked open the surface of everything I thought was solid. At home, my husband greeted me with his usual calm smile, asking how late I'd had to stay. I answered automatically, setting down my bag, hanging up my coat. But even as I spoke, I felt the weight of that elevator pressing down on me again, the hum of the lights, the closeness of that space, the suddenness of it all. I lay in bed that night, staring into the dark, the ceiling fan slicing the silence above me. I told myself it was a slip, an accident born of stress and proximity. I told myself it didn't mean anything. But the memory of that kiss was already looping in my mind, not fading, not softening. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered the thing I didn't want to admit, that one kiss had just changed everything, and I couldn't take it back. The morning after the elevator felt oddly quiet, even for our house. I woke before the alarm, lying there in that half-light when the room feels like it's still deciding whether to let the day in. My husband's breathing was steady beside me, the familiar sound of his sleep, and yet I felt out of place in my own bed. I lay staring at the ceiling, counting the faint cracks in the plaster like they might hold answers. But they didn't. It wasn't guilt, not exactly, not yet. Guilt was a word that felt too blunt for what was brewing in me. What I felt was an unsteady awareness, like the way your balance shifts when you step onto a moving train. Everything looked the same, my kitchen, my reflection in the bathroom mirror, the half-empty cereal box on the counter, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was seeing it all through different eyes. At breakfast, I poured coffee for my husband, steady hands masking an unsteady mind. He talked about the weather, about an article he'd read, about a bill that needed to be paid by Friday. I nodded in all the right places, gave the right smiles, but every few seconds, my thoughts flickered back to that single moment in the elevator. The brief press of lips, the silence after. I told myself again and again, it was nothing. A slip. A reaction. That's all. But when I closed my eyes to rinse the mugs at the sink, I could still feel it, not the kiss itself, but the shift it had created. At the office that morning, I walked in determined to anchor myself in routine. I clung to the mundane emails, the soft thrum of printers, the faint smell of stale coffee. I thought if I drowned in the ordinary, the memory would dull, fade into the background. But then I saw him. He was standing near the conference room, sleeves rolled as always, flipping through a file with that same easy calm that seemed to slow the air around him. He looked up when I entered, and for a fraction of a second, our eyes met. There was no smirk, no gesture, just a flicker of recognition, an acknowledgement of what had happened the night before. And that was enough. The kiss came back in an instant, not just the act, but the way the elevator had seemed smaller, the way the silence had thickened. I looked away first, my cheeks warming with a heat that had nothing to do with the office thermostat. The day went on, but it didn't feel like any other day. Every glance across the room felt heavier, every casual "can you file this" landed differently. Words became layered, simple on the surface but carrying undercurrents. By lunch, I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if there really was something in the way he lingered when handing me a folder, his fingers brushing mine for just a second too long. The tiniest gestures started to feel like messages, though neither of us spoke of the night before. At home, the shift was more subtle, but no less real. My husband asked about my day, and I answered in neat, tidy phrases: busy, a little stressful, fine. But there was one word I couldn't say: uneventful, because that would have been a lie. In the kitchen that evening, as I sliced vegetables for dinner, my hands moved automatically, muscle memory from years of repetition. But my mind wasn't in that kitchen. It was in an elevator. It was in a single instant I couldn't seem to erase. The more I tried to suppress it, the sharper it became. Like trying to push down a spring only to feel it pressing back harder. I told myself to stop thinking about it, to stop replaying it. But each time my mind whispered don't, another part of me whispered remember. The hardest part wasn't the kiss itself, it was what it stirred. Not a rush of infatuation or some foolish romantic notion, but something quieter, more dangerous, a hunger. A reminder that part of me, long buried under years of routine and predictability, could still spark. That night, lying in bed again, the ceiling fan tracing slow, lazy circles above us, I stared into the dark and wondered when just one moment stops being just that. Because already, I knew, it wasn't nothing anymore. The following week unfolded with a strange sense of tension, like a string pulled just tight enough to hum. I went to the office each morning with the same routine I'd always had: coffee in the car, a quick scan of emails before anyone else arrived, small talk in the break room, but under the surface, everything felt different. I could feel the memory of the elevator kiss like a bruise, not always visible, but tender to the touch, sensitive when something brushed against it unexpectedly. I thought maybe he would act as though nothing had happened, and part of me prayed for that. If we could both pretend it was a momentary lapse, maybe it would fade on its own. But reality was more complicated. He wasn't overtly different, no bold gestures, no inappropriate remarks, but there was a subtle change. He held eye contact just a little too long. He stood a fraction closer when handing me documents. Tiny things, really, but they accumulated, like water slowly rising against a dam. It was on Thursday that he asked if I could stay late to help sort out a backlog of paperwork. His tone was casual, his words simple: if you have time, could you stay after hours? But underneath the formality, there was something else, a quiet suggestion that staying would mean more than just finishing reports. I said yes. It was almost automatic, the way the words slipped out, and as soon as I heard my own voice, I knew I had stepped over another line. That evening, the office emptied slowly, the clatter of keyboards and muted conversations dwindling until the only sounds left were the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint ticking of the clock above the reception desk. I worked quietly, trying to lose myself in the shuffle of papers, but every time he passed my desk, I felt it, the weight of his presence. He didn't linger unnecessarily, but there was an awareness between us, a kind of unspoken acknowledgement that neither of us seemed willing, or able, to break. When the work was done, I expected him to leave first, to say a polite goodnight and disappear down the hall. Instead, he stayed. He leaned against the edge of my desk, arms loosely crossed, his voice light as he asked, "How are you finding the job so far?" It was an innocent question on the surface, one I'd been asked a dozen times before, but that night it felt different. I answered honestly, more honestly than I meant to, telling him it was good to feel useful again, that I liked the rhythm of the office, that sometimes it felt like the days at home had blurred into one another before this job. He listened, really listened, and that was the dangerous part. It wasn't that my husband didn't listen, he did in his way, but this was different. This felt like being studied, like my words were being placed carefully on an invisible scale. The conversation drifted, slowly, from safe topics to ones that felt closer to the bone. He mentioned how he used to stay late all the time when he first started, how the quiet hours after everyone left made him think differently, focus differently. I admitted that I liked the stillness too, though I didn't say why. At one point, he reached for a file that had slid too close to the edge of my desk. His hand brushed against mine, not accidentally, I don't think, though neither of us acknowledged it. It wasn't a bold move. It wasn't a declaration. But it was enough. The air felt thick after that, filled with things not said. I stood to gather my things, and he stepped back just slightly, the faintest curve of a smile on his lips, not mocking, not gloating, just there. We didn't cross any obvious lines that night, not really. There was no repeat of the kiss from the elevator, no overt betrayal. But as I drove home, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything that had actually happened. We didn't need to kiss again for this to keep growing. It was already happening. At home, the evening played out like any other dinner, dishes, the soft murmur of the television in the background. My husband asked how late I'd had to stay, and I told him the truth, just catching up on work. But even as I said it, I could feel the gap widening between what I shared and what I kept to myself. It wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the whole truth either. Lying in bed that night, I thought about the look in his eyes when he leaned against my desk, the subtle shift in his voice when the office was empty and the world outside felt very far away. I thought about how easy it had been to say yes when he asked me to stay late, how natural it had felt. And that scared me more than the kiss in the elevator ever had. Because now, I wasn't just reacting. I was choosing. By the time the second Friday rolled around, I had convinced myself that the tension might settle if I just kept my distance, kept my head down, and reminded myself that it had only been a kiss in a broken elevator. That was the story I told myself over and over, like a mantra meant to hold everything steady. But mantras don't always hold when reality keeps nudging them apart. That morning started ordinary enough, traffic slower than usual, a coffee stain on my blouse that I covered with my scarf, the usual stream of emails waiting when I arrived. I buried myself in the routine, shuffling papers, answering calls, sending polite, forgettable replies to people I would never meet in person. But under all of it, that quiet hum of awareness remained. He wasn't in the office when I arrived, and I felt that in an odd, hollow way. It was easier not to see him, easier to pretend things were normal when he wasn't there. But around noon, he walked in, and the shift was instant, like a dial being turned. He didn't make any grand entrance, didn't acknowledge me with anything more than a nod, but my pulse still skipped, that traitorous, involuntary reaction I hated and couldn't control. The day dragged and disappeared all at once. Around 5, people started packing up, the office slowly emptying into the weekend. I had my bag over my shoulder when I heard his voice behind me. "Are you heading out now?" It was such an ordinary question, but there was something in the way he asked it, light, but with an undertone that kept me standing still. "I was going to," I said, turning halfway toward him. He glanced at the stack of files on my desk, then back at me. "I was planning to go over those reports tonight. Would you mind staying for a bit? Just to help sort through them." The reasonable answer was no. I had a life, a husband waiting for me, a dinner I should have been making. But the word didn't come out. Of course, I said instead, and just like that, the office emptied around us again. By 7, it was just the two of us. The light outside the windows had shifted to that soft, dusky blue that makes everything inside feel sharper. We worked quietly at first, passing papers back and forth, trading small observations about which reports belonged where. But as the hours stretched, the rhythm slowed, the silences grew longer. At one point, I stood to grab another stack from the cabinet, and when I turned, he was standing closer than I expected. Not close enough to be inappropriate, not close enough to give anyone watching a reason to talk, but close enough that the space between us felt like something we were both very aware of. Our conversation drifted, the way it had before, off work, into lighter things. He asked what I usually did on weekends. I said the usual: errands, laundry, dinner with my husband, maybe a movie at home. My voice sounded too casual, like I was describing someone else's life. Then there was another pause, one of those stretches of silence that feel loaded with words unsaid. And before I could overthink it, before either of us could retreat, it happened again. We kissed. This time, it wasn't a startled, reflexive thing like the elevator. It wasn't quick and uncertain. It was deliberate, slower, like an unspoken agreement we both stepped into at the same time. When it ended, I stepped back first, heart racing so hard it felt like I'd just run up a flight of stairs. Neither of us spoke. He only looked at me, his expression unreadable but steady, as though he'd been expecting this all along. I gathered my things with trembling hands, suddenly hyper-aware of every sound, the scrape of a chair, the faint buzz of the overhead lights. The office felt too quiet, and yet inside me, everything was loud. The drive home was a blur. My fingers clenched the steering wheel tighter than they needed to, my mind replaying that second kiss again and again, like a film reel that wouldn't stop spinning. Walking through the front door, the smell of dinner already cooking hit me. My husband had decided to make pasta, the simple kind he knew I liked. He smiled when he saw me, asked how late I'd had to stay. I told him the same thing I had the week before, just finishing reports. It wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the truth either. Later, in bed, I lay still, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing beside me. My body felt heavy, like it had been carrying something too long, but my mind was restless. That kiss hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a mistake of circumstance. It had been a choice. And that realization didn't just scare me, it settled into me, deep and certain, because now I knew I wouldn't be able to pretend it was nothing anymore. The next morning, I woke with a different kind of heaviness, the kind that settles not in the body but in the mind, like a fog you can't quite clear. The memory of that second kiss clung to me, sharper than the first, because there was no way to file it under accident this time. It had been a choice, one I had made, one we had made, and now the line between thought and action had blurred beyond repair. At breakfast, the kitchen smelled of toast and coffee, the familiar scent of a routine I'd followed for years. My husband sat at the table scrolling through his phone, humming under his breath, oblivious to the storm in my head. I poured him coffee, my hand steady only because I forced it to be. He thanked me without looking up, and I stared at his bent head for a beat too long, wondering if the words I wasn't saying were somehow visible, if he could sense them hanging in the air. I left for work early, needing the space, needing the car ride to clear my thoughts. But the drive didn't clear anything, it only gave me time to think, and thinking only made it worse. Every red light, every stop sign, every long stretch of road gave my mind room to replay the night before. When I walked into the office, I tried to compose myself, to pretend nothing had changed. But I felt it instantly, the awareness between us. He was already there, leaning over a stack of folders, his sleeves pushed up as always. He looked up briefly when I entered, that same measured glance, that same unreadable calm. Nothing in his expression betrayed anything inappropriate. And yet I felt it, the tension, the thing that lived between words and glances, the thing no one else could see. I buried myself in work, letting emails and phone calls and reports dull the edge of what I was feeling. But avoidance only lasts so long. By mid-morning, the moment I'd been dreading came in the smallest form. My phone buzzed. A message. It wasn't from him, not yet, but the vibration jolted me all the same. My husband's name flashed on the screen. Did you remember to pay the electricity bill? Simple. Mundane. Safe. And for some reason, it made me feel worse. I responded quickly, fingers stiff on the keys. Before setting the phone face down on my desk like that would erase the unease. It didn't. Around lunchtime, he came by my desk with a document that needed my signature. He didn't linger, didn't lower his voice, didn't do anything that would raise suspicion. But when our hands touched for the briefest second, I felt it again, the spark, the reminder, the thing I was trying so hard to bury. By afternoon, the air in the office felt thicker, or maybe it was just me. I caught myself watching the clock, not to go home, but counting down to when the building would empty again, when the noise would fade, when the world would shrink to just the two of us once more. But that night, it wasn't staying late that shifted things. It was my phone. At home, after dinner, as I was cleaning up the dishes, my phone buzzed again. I wiped my hands on a towel, reached for it without thinking. It was a message from him. Nothing explicit, nothing that anyone else would find unusual. Good work today. Thank you for staying so organized. But I stared at it longer than I should have, my thumb hovering over the screen. And then another message came. Not suggestive. Not incriminating. Just friendly, even polite. But it was enough. Enough for my husband to notice. What's that? He asked from the table, his voice casual. I told him it was just work, and technically, that was true. He didn't push, didn't even look suspicious. But as I slipped the phone back into my pocket, I felt the first real crack form, the first time the possibility of being caught felt tangible, the first time I wondered if he saw something in my face that I didn't intend to show. That night, lying in bed, the phone rested on my nightstand, the screen dark, but my thoughts kept circling it. I thought of the first kiss. I thought of the second. And I thought of the messages I hadn't deleted. Because somewhere deep down, I knew this couldn't stay hidden forever. And the truth terrified me, not because of what might happen when it came out, but because part of me wasn't sure if I even wanted to stop. That evening began like any other, though I can see now that nothing about it was ordinary. I told myself it was just another late night, another round of catching up on reports the way we both pretended that phrase meant only what it said. The decision to stay late wasn't even a decision anymore, it was a reflex, something that rolled off my tongue before I'd even thought it through. He asked softly, almost offhand, if I could go over some figures with him after hours, and my agreement came too quickly, too easily. I didn't even check my phone to see if my husband had texted about dinner plans. I didn't pause to weigh anything in my mind. The word yes left my mouth like it had been waiting there all day. By the time most of the office emptied out, the corridors grew still, and that familiar quiet settled in, a quiet I'd come to expect, to crave, though I couldn't admit that to anyone, least of all myself. The hum of the overhead lights sounded louder when the phones stopped ringing and the chatter faded. He stayed at his desk for a while, leafing through papers, and I worked quietly at mine, pretending to be focused on spreadsheets I'd already checked twice. Every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing up, not at him, exactly, but at the space he filled. When he finally stood and said, "I'll drive you home after this," it didn't even sound like an offer. It sounded like a plan that had already been made. I could have said no. I could have mentioned that my husband would wonder why I hadn't driven myself. But I didn't. I only nodded, like this was the most natural thing in the world. By the time we left the building, the sky outside had already slipped into darkness, the kind that comes early in autumn, heavy and soft at the same time. The parking lot was nearly empty, the street lamps casting small pools of light that didn't quite touch each other. The car ride started in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, not exactly, but the kind that felt full, dense, almost deliberate. The road stretched ahead, and I watched the lights blur past the passenger window, the colors of traffic signals reflecting faintly across the dashboard. We talked eventually, but the words didn't matter much. A comment about the weather. Something about work the next day. Small talk, as thin as tissue paper. Then came the turn. It wasn't the one I expected, the route to my house was straightforward, easy. But the car didn't follow it. He turned instead onto a quieter road, a stretch with fewer lights, and my breath caught for just a second. I didn't ask why. I didn't say anything at all. The road curved, the trees on either side arching over like they were trying to see, and still I said nothing. The next part is difficult to describe, not because I don't remember, but because I remember it too well. We stopped somewhere I couldn't even name now if I tried, a place between one thing and another, not quite nowhere, but not anywhere specific either. What happened next was simple in words and impossible in weight. We spent the night together. There is nothing more to add to that sentence, not here, not in detail, not an explanation, because the truth is that those 5 words hold more than any description ever could. When it was over, when the night had stretched into morning, the quiet on the drive back felt different. He didn't speak, and I didn't either. The only sound was the low hum of the engine, the occasional crackle of the tires on uneven pavement. When we pulled up near my house, I stared at the front door for a long time before stepping out. The house looked exactly as it had when I left, the same porch light, the same neat line of shoes by the mat, but to me, it didn't look like the same house anymore. Inside, everything felt too still, too fragile. My husband had already left for the day, his breakfast dishes rinsed and stacked neatly by the sink. That small, ordinary gesture, the rinsed dishes, hit me harder than I expected. I set down my bag on the kitchen counter and stood there for what felt like forever, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of what I had done settle like stones in my chest. Nothing about me would look different to anyone else. I would stand at the same sink, use the same keys, wear the same clothes. But I knew. And now, there was no going back. The morning after that night felt unreal, though the world around me looked painfully ordinary. The sunlight was sharp, the coffee bitter, the same dishes sat in the sink waiting to be washed. I moved through the motions of my day like someone following a script, every gesture practiced, every word automatic. But inside, the script had been torn apart, rewritten, and now nothing fit the same way. When my husband spoke to me over breakfast, his tone was as even as ever. He asked if I had slept well. I said yes, even though I had barely slept at all. He told me about a meeting he had later in the day. I nodded, smiled when I needed to, and tried not to hear the hollow echo of my own voice. At the office, I kept my head down. There was no meeting of eyes that morning, no wordless acknowledgement, not even the faintest smile across the room. It was as if we both silently decided that the only way forward was to act as though the night before hadn't happened. But pretending is heavier than honesty. Every time I filed a report or sent an email, every time I heard his voice giving instructions to someone else, there was a quiet thrum beneath the surface. Not a memory, it was more immediate than that. It was the knowledge of what we had done, something that clung to every exchange like an invisible shadow. By lunchtime, I found myself staring at my phone more than usual. Not waiting for a message exactly, but aware of the possibility. The device felt heavier in my hand than it ever had, as though every notification might tip my life in one direction or another. When a message did come, it wasn't from him, not then. It was my husband, *, how's your day? Do you want me to pick up anything for dinner? Asterisk. Such a simple text. Harmless, even sweet. And it made me feel like my chest was collapsing in on itself. I typed back quickly, a smiley face, a reassurance, something easy. But the unease didn't fade. That evening, I tried to live as if nothing had changed. I stood at the stove, stirring pasta sauce, the scent of garlic and tomatoes filling the kitchen like it always did. My husband leaned against the counter, telling me about his day, and I forced myself to meet his eyes, to respond, to laugh when the moment called for it. But every time my phone buzzed on the table, I felt my stomach tighten. Even if it was just a spam email or a reminder from the bank, my heart still jumped, my mind still whispered, what if it's him? That was the strangest part. I wasn't afraid of a message coming, I was afraid of what it meant that I wanted one to come. Later that night, lying in bed, I thought about the layers of secrecy that had already formed. Not dramatic, cinematic secrets, just quiet ones, built from omissions and careful silences. I didn't tell my husband that I'd stayed later than necessary. I didn't tell him why I'd come home so tired. I didn't tell him that a simple vibration from my phone could send a jolt through me that no one else would see. In the dim light of our bedroom, his back turned toward me, I lay awake and counted the spaces where truth should have been spoken but wasn't. Every one of them felt like a crack in the walls around me. The house looked the same. The office looked the same. But I knew those cracks were there. And each day, they were spreading. The discovery didn't happen with raised voices or sudden accusations. It happened quietly, in a way that somehow felt worse. It was late afternoon on a Wednesday, and I was home earlier than usual. My husband had taken the day off for errands, and the house felt unusually full of him, his jacket draped over the back of the chair, his shoes by the door, his coffee mug still sitting on the counter with a faint ring of brown at the bottom. I was rinsing dishes at the sink when I heard the faint buzz of my phone from the table behind me. I didn't think much of it. It wasn't hidden. I hadn't been secretive about where I left it, at least, not intentionally. The message preview flashed on the screen, a name that shouldn't have made me freeze the way it did. He picked it up before I did. He didn't snatch it or scroll with suspicion, he simply reached for it like anyone would when a phone is buzzing beside them. He glanced at the screen, just a quick, instinctive look. But that look was enough. I turned too late, towel still in my hand, my throat suddenly dry. He was already reading. Not rifling through, not scrolling frantically, just reading. And I stood there, watching. I saw his expression change in the smallest ways, barely perceptible but devastating. His brow tightened. His mouth flattened. His breathing slowed. There wasn't anything explicit in the messages. No declarations. No confessions. But there was enough. Enough warmth between words. Enough familiarity that couldn't be explained away. I walked toward him, my steps slow, as if that could somehow undo what was already unraveling. "Can I have my phone?" I said, trying to sound calm. My voice betrayed me. He didn't answer. He just kept reading. I reached out, but he shifted slightly, not angrily, just reflexively, moving the phone out of reach. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't accusing. He was silent. And somehow that silence felt louder than any confrontation could have been. I could see the exact message that made his hand tremble, just slightly, but enough. A simple line, asterisk, "Thanks again for last night." Asterisk. That was all. Nothing overt, nothing undeniable. But it was everything. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words tangled and collapsed before they reached the air. He looked up at me finally, and the look in his eyes was not rage. It was worse. It was a quiet, dawning understanding. In that moment, The kitchen felt unbearably small. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. The sound of water dripping from the dish towel in my hand was sharp, intrusive. I wanted to explain. I wanted to say something that would make the words on that screen mean something else. But there was nothing. I thought of all the things I hadn't deleted, all the small, careless moments I hadn't even thought twice about, each one now a piece of evidence I hadn't realized I'd left lying around. He set the phone down on the table, very gently, as if it might shatter if he moved too quickly. The silence stretched between us, thick, unbearable. And I realized something that chilled me more than anything else. He didn't have to say a word. Because he knew. And I knew that he knew. And in that fragile, quiet kitchen, with the faint smell of coffee and dish soap still in the air, everything we had built together began to fracture, not with an explosion, but with the softest, sharpest sound of something breaking inside both of us. The hours after he put my phone down felt like they belonged to someone else's life. I stood in the same kitchen, surrounded by the same walls, the same familiar clutter, the stack of unopened mail, the bowl of fruit beginning to bruise on the counter, but none of it felt real. It was as though I was watching myself from across the room, a stranger in my own body, going through the motions of someone who hadn't just watched the foundation of her marriage crack in complete silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't even ask a single question. That might have been the hardest part. Because in the absence of words, there was nothing for me to answer, nothing for me to deny, no immediate argument to make. There was just the weight of his quiet understanding pressing down on me like a heavy hand on my chest. I wanted him to speak. I wanted him to shout, to demand explanations, to tell me what he was thinking, because at least then I could respond, defend, apologize, explain. But he didn't. He sat down at the table, his fingers resting lightly on the wood as if holding on to it, grounding himself in the feel of it beneath his palms. I sat across from him, but the distance between us felt wider than the width of the table. The kind of distance you can't measure in feet. Every sound seemed too loud, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant creak of the house settling, the faint rustle as he shifted in his chair. I could hear my own breathing, unsteady, and it only made the silence feel heavier. Eventually, he stood, not abruptly, but with a kind of quiet finality that made my throat tighten. He didn't slam the chair back. He didn't storm out. He just pushed the chair in slowly and walked out of the kitchen, up the stairs, the soft creak of each step landing like a drumbeat. I stayed at the table, hands flat on the cool wood, staring at my phone where it still sat, screen dark now. My reflection in the black glass looked distorted, my face drawn and pale. I thought about the messages he had seen. Not just the words, but the spaces between them, the gaps where meaning lived. None of them had been explicit. None of them had been undeniable on their own. But together, they told a story I hadn't intended to write, and now I couldn't unwrite it. I don't know how long I sat there. The clock ticked, the light outside shifted from evening to night, and still I sat, my mind circling the same thoughts. How it had started. Where it had gone. How every choice I'd made, every yes I'd said without thinking, had brought me here. Upstairs, I could hear him moving around the bedroom, drawers opening and closing, the faint shuffle of clothes being folded or put away. Not angry movements. Careful ones. Controlled. I stayed downstairs, unsure if I was giving him space or avoiding him, unsure which one I needed more. Later, when I finally climbed the stairs, the hallway felt longer than it ever had. The bedroom door was open, the light inside dim. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, hands clasped loosely, looking down at the floor. I paused in the doorway, my body heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. He didn't look up right away, and when he did, his expression was impossible to read. Not blank, not hard, just quiet. I wanted to speak, but the words felt too small for what needed to be said. What could I offer him? I'm sorry felt hollow. It didn't mean anything felt like a lie, because meaning had crept in whether I'd wanted it to or not. I stood there, the silence between us stretching, and I understood in a way I hadn't before that nothing I said in that moment could fix what had been broken. Some fractures can't be sealed with words. That night, we didn't fight. We didn't talk much at all. He lay down eventually, turning away slightly, and I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, the darkness above me feeling thicker than it ever had. I thought about how it had all begun, not with the night we spent together, not even with the first kiss in the elevator, but with the smallest choices. Staying late at work. Saying yes when I should have said no. Letting silences linger instead of breaking them. The truth is, there's rarely one moment when everything falls apart. It happens in fragments, in almost invisible slips, in the quiet decisions you don't think matter until they've added up into something you can't undo. Lying there, I realized I couldn't go back to the person I'd been before all of this. That version of me, the one who thought her marriage was unshakable, who thought she could control where her choices led, was gone. And what was left was a woman staring into the dark, unsure of what came next, knowing only that everything had changed. Because some things you can't explain away. Some things you can't erase. And some things, no matter how much you wish you could, will stay with you forever.